The Philosophy of P. D. Ouspensky. The recent publication of a third posthumous work of P. D. Ouspensky provides an occasion for reviewing the teaching of an original philosophical thinker who has received little notice from academic philosophers. Life. Peter Damianovich Ouspensky was born in Moscow in 1878. After graduating from the University of Moscow, where he majored in science, he became a journalist in that city. He later recalled as a turning point in his life an incident at the age of 29 when, in revulsion against an assignment to write a favorable editorial about what he considered the futile Hague Conference, he turned to his collection of occult literature and, glancing through these books which, while very naive, yet, unlike the barren arid desert of positivism, leads somewhere, he grasped what became the leading principle of his philosophy, the idea that the fourth dimension is the key to the mysteries of the world. In the conviction that there must be some truth behind the persistent tradition of esoteric schools still existing in the East, he started on what was intended to be an extensive Oriental trip in search, as he put it, of the miraculous. These travels were interrupted by the outbreak of the First World War, which compelled him to return to Moscow, where he engaged in journalism, lecturing, and writing. In 1915 he made the acquaintance of the Caucasian occultist George Ivanovich Gurdjieff, and soon came completely under the spell of that teacher's odd but apparently fascinating personality. The Communist Revolution, which Ouspensky considered the catastrophic end of Russian history, forced him into exile, first in southern Russia, then at Gurdjieff's home in the Caucasus, where, with other disciples, he rejoined the master to continue training in physical and mental exercises intended to develop psychic powers. In 1921 he settled in London. For a while he maintained his association with Gurdjieff, who had established the school at Fontainebleau, but in 1924 he announced to his students that thereafter his own work would proceed independently. He continued to teach and write in England until his death in 1947. Works 5 books by Ouspensky have appeared in English: A System of Philosophy, Tertium Organum, a collection of essays, a new model of the universe, a novel, Strange Life of Ivan Ozogin, an autobiography, In Search of the Miraculous, and a course of lectures, The Psychology of Man's Possible Evolution. Tertium Organum, published in Russian in 1912, is the most interesting and important of these works. The title is explained as meaning that the book is about the third canon of thought, namely the mystical, which has always existed, although for us moderns it appears as a third method after the deductive and inductive methods described by Aristotle and Bacon. The English translation by Nicholas Bessarabov and Claude Bragdon was published by Marner's Press in 1920, and again, revised, by Knopf in 1922. The simplicity of the literary style, the short sentences and paragraphs, and the clarity with which subtle arguments are developed show the influence of the author's training as a journalist and make one wish that all philosophers were required to serve an apprenticeship in newspaper writing. In content, Tertium Organum is a systematic treatise on epistemology. The first 7 chapters are an objective survey of the physical world. The author considers that the most basic problem of physics is why space has just 3 dimensions, and he concludes that it is impossible to find any answer to this question in an objective study of the world of space and time. Consequently, taking as a clue Kant's thesis that space and time are forms of intuition, and inferring from this that we bear within ourselves the conditions of our space, he approaches the problem subjectively. In the following chapters he endeavors to show how our mode of consciousness makes space 3-dimensional, how other modes of consciousness would, and for other beings do, make it of fewer or more dimensions, and how these different spaces are related to each other. The next to last chapter is a collection of selections from mystical literature, with comments, and the concluding chapter considers the cosmic consciousness with has for its object a world of 4 dimensions. An appendix gives a table showing the space and time sense, psychology, logic, mathematics, forms of action, morals, forms of consciousness, forms of knowledge, and forms of science characteristic of, as well as the different beings characterized by, 4 forms of the manifestation of consciousness. A new model of the universe, written and revised at various times between 1905 and 1929, was translated into English by R. Merton and published by Knopf in 1931. While it has the same lucid journalistic style as Tertium Organum, it is quite different from the earlier book. Instead of a systematic argument, it is a collection of 12 separate essays. Instead of a theory, it consists of questions, suggestions, and guesses. The purpose of Tertium Organum is to set forth systematically those truths which Ouspensky believes he understands clearly and distinctly. The purpose of a new model of the universe is to explore some parts of that infinite field of mystery which various aspects of experience reveal. Here he solves no problems and comes to few conclusions, but rather suggests the subjective impressions aroused by these more profound questions which elude his understanding, as they do the understanding of us all, but do not escape his interest, and it is here that he differs from most of us. The first 3 essays are primarily epistemological, esotericism and modern thought, concerned with evolution within the human race, the possibility of mystical knowledge, and the concept of esotericism. The 4th dimension, which discusses some of the unsolved problems of the theory of space and time of Tertium Organum, and Superman, in which various types of humanity are compared. The next 3 essays are primarily religious, Christianity and the New Testament, which attempts to show that Christ's teaching was neither otherworldly nor so ideal as to be impracticable, but quite practical and intended for this life, yet practical just because it was not for everybody. The symbolism of the tarot, a series of subjective and impressionistic meditations suggested by contemplation of the cards of the tarot pack, and What is Yoga? A critical study of the 5 types of yoga. The next 3 essays are primarily psychological, on the study of dreams and on hypnotism, Ouspensky's technique for studying dreams, especially those which we have while awake, experimental mysticism, an evaluation of his own attempts to stimulate the mystical consciousness artificially, and In Search of the Miraculous, a series of sketches of Notre Dame, the pyramids and Sphinx, the sapphire-eyed Buddha of Ceylon, the Taj Mahal, and the whirling dervishes of Constantinople. The last 3 essays are primarily scientific, a new model of the universe, devoted to some philosophical implications of relativity and quantum mechanics, eternal recurrence and the laws of Manu, concerned with time, reincarnation, and devolution of the individual, including the peculiarly difficult concept of reincarnation into the past, and sex and devolution, which concludes the book with a discussion of the evolution of the individual in terms of the evolution of the sensual, normal, and celibate forms of sex. Strange Life of Ivan Osokin, a philosophical novel of 166 pages, was published by Holmes Press in 1947, shortly after Ouspensky's death. The Russian original had appeared in 1917. In the medium of fiction, Ouspensky's vivid style is manifested in rapid action, and the story moves swiftly. The plot itself is very simple. A summary of it can hardly sound other than banal, and can give no suggestion of the powerful impression of the book itself. Osokin, a young man who has made a failure of his life through making the wrong decisions at crucial moments, indulges in the common fantasy of reliving his life. Like most of us, he is convinced that all would be well if only he could live his life over again, knowing in advance what he knows now. The story hinges on the fact that Osokin is enabled, by the aid of a magician, to do exactly that. He finds himself a schoolboy of 14, in precisely the same circumstances as before, but clearly remembering his past, or rather future, life to the age of 26. Knowing just what he had formerly done wrong, and seeing clearly just what he needs to do in order to fulfill his desires, he is prepared for every crisis. Yet on every occasion he actually does exactly what he did before. The obvious lesson of this simple story is to deny the Socratic doctrine that virtue is knowledge, but the more profound meaning which the author intends to convey can only be understood, I take it, in terms of the theory of eternal recurrence, discussed in A New Model of the Universe. In Search of the Miraculous, published by Harcourt Brace in 1949, is an unhappy anticlimax to the list of Ouspensky's writings, and it would be unfortunate if anyone got his first impression of him from this dull book. While the style is similar to that of his other books, the content is much less interesting, because this work is devoted not to Ouspensky's philosophy but to Gurdjieff's. It is a journal of the years 1915 to 1924, when the author was studying under Gurdjieff, and it consists almost entirely of notes on the latter's instruction. Gurdjieff's character and personality, in spite of the disciples' attempt to present them favorably, appear rather disagreeable, and his doctrines are peculiarly unappealing. While one hesitates to speak dogmatically about matters he may not understand, I believe that even persons sympathetic with occultism will find little of interest in this fantastic jumble of pseudo-alchemy, pseudo-astrology, and pseudo-musicology. This opinion seems to be confirmed by the recent posthumous publication of the first volume of Gurdjieff's own writings, in which the pure Gurdjieff, lacking the sugar coating of Ouspensky's style, is so dull as to be unreadable. While one wonders how a man of Ouspensky's intellectual and moral force could have been so captivated by this teaching, we must also realize that he finally repudiated it and that it had little if any influence on his other works. The Psychology of Man's Possible Evolution, a series of 5 brief lectures composed in 1934, was published in 1950 by Hedgehog Press. It is a protracted work with little value apart from the oral instruction it was designed to introduce, yet it forms a fitting conclusion to the body of Ouspensky's works. It speaks not of theory but of practice. It is concerned with the infinite possibilities of higher evolution, possibilities based on the already existing nature of the human soul with its vast but mostly unrealized potencies, which can be realized only by deliberate effort guided by esoteric instruction. The lesson of the book is a combined pessimism and optimism which is the heart of Ouspensky's philosophy. For the human race as such, and for the majority of individuals, there is no hope of improvement, but for any individual who so wills the way is open to rise above humanity to a higher form of being. Sources. Among the many sources which contributed to Ouspensky's philosophy as presented in Tertium Organum, first place must be given to Kant. The epistemological theory can be thought of as an attempt to go on from where Kant left off. Kant undertook to demonstrate how the laws of the phenomenal world are determined by the forms of intuition, space and time, characteristic of the human mind, but he did not show why we have these forms of intuition. This is what Ouspensky tries to explain. In general, Ouspensky considers himself in the classical tradition of Western philosophy, and frequent references are made to classical philosophers, especially Plato. Mystical writers, both Western and Eastern, are quoted in connection with the philosophy of mysticism which is a central feature of Tertium Organum. In particular, Plotinus's treatise on intelligible beauty is cited as the most precise formulation of the third canon of thought, which he knows. Occult and theosophical writers also influenced his thought, and are always referred to sympathetically. Scientific theories current in his lifetime strongly influenced his philosophy and its expression, especially the theory of evolution and the theory of relativity. The former, which had such a dominant influence on early 20th century thought, affected his way of presenting his doctrine rather than the doctrine itself. and he warns against understanding biological evolution too naively. Ideas associated with the theory of relativity, especially those of N.A. Umhoff and H. Minkowski, are of the greatest importance for his treatment of the fourth dimension. Two books are discussed at some length. A New Era of Thought, by C. H. Hinton, he considers an ingenious, although inevitably futile, attempt to arrive at an understanding of four-dimensional space by objective means, that is, by a mathematical study of space itself. Cosmic Consciousness, by R. M. Buck, he considers as presenting the correct subjective approach to epistemology, but as vitiated by the error of believing the higher consciousness to be evolving with the human race, instead of being, as Ouspensky believes, characteristic of a small minority within it. If theory of knowledge Ouspensky's epistemology is set forth systematically in Tertium Organum. We know that we exist as conscious minds and that the world around us exists, but we do not know clearly either our own nature or the nature of the world or how they are related to each other. The world exists, or at least appears to us as existing, in time and space, the latter having three dimensions. The distinction of time and space, however, can hardly be an objective reality. Events known to us are arranged in a four-dimensional continuum. We classify them as past events which are unreal because no longer existing, present events which are real but of zero duration, and future events which are unreal because not yet having occurred, and perhaps not yet even determined. But it is absurd to restrict reality to an infinitesimal, and perpetually vanishing, section of what we know. Objectively, past and future events are no less real than present ones. The problem of knowledge is to explain why we see things in this paradoxical way, why we see only a three-dimensional cross-section of the four-dimensional reality. Scientific or mathematical study of the physical world, that is, of time and space and the phenomena occurring in them, throws little or no light on this problem. Since physics studies the relations among events in time and space, it cannot inquire into the cause of time and space themselves, which are presupposed by its techniques. According to Kant, the source of time and space as forms of the phenomenal world is to be found not in the objects known but in the nature of the knowing subject. If this is so, the explanation of our distinction between time and space must be sought in an analysis of our way of knowing, that is, our sort of thought or consciousness. We know the world by means of sensations, perceptions, and by emotions concepts. To find Kant also s. thesis to a limited that extent time and space more vaguely are our forms of intuition is correct, then time and space as we apprehend them must depend on our way of knowing the world, namely by sensation, perception, and conception. This conclusion would be confirmed if we could compare our way of knowing with other ways of knowing, which employed more or fewer than these three faculties, and could see how the same objective reality would appear to such minds as phenomenal worlds different from our phenomenal world with its time and its three-dimensional space. Spiritually and artistically inclined persons do use the faculty of emotion more than most of us, and they do describe the world in terms of values and eternal verities not intelligible in physical concepts. But it is difficult for us to understand the experience of a consciousness which is higher than ours in the sense of using a fourth mental faculty. If we could find a consciousness lower than ours in the sense of having only some of our faculties, we might hope to understand how the world would appear to it. And the relation of its world to ours would provide an analogy for considering the relation of our world to a higher one. This condition is fulfilled in the consciousness of animals. Animals have no concepts, as is shown by their lack of language, without which concepts are impossible. They know the world, therefore, by sensations and perceptions only. In the case of the lower animals, their anatomy and behavior indicate that they lack even the faculty of perception and so must have knowledge based on mere sensation. Animals, apprehending the world by perception without concepts, see it as two-dimensional. We know that this is true because we ourselves perceive the world as two-dimensional. We actually perceive only the surfaces of things, not their interiors. The field of vision is a two-dimensional continuum. We ordinarily complete our apprehension of a perceived object by adding the third dimension, but this requires a higher mental faculty. The animal, lacking this faculty, apprehends only the perceived field of vision, and for him, consequently, the world is two-dimensional. The lower animal, restricted to sensation, cannot even combine his sensations into an ordered field, for this requires perception, and for him the world can only be a sequence of sensations, one-dimensional. The third dimension, never perceived, is introduced into our experience by our peculiarly human faculty of forming concepts by abstraction from perceptions. When we walk around a house, we perceive an infinite number of different appearances as we regard it from different directions. We do not consider these appearances to be an infinite number of different things, because we integrate them into the one object we call a house, an object which can include an infinite number of two-dimensional aspects because it is itself three-dimensional. Abstracted or integrated from a succession of perceptions, a house is not a percept but a concept. We perform this intermental performing operation it very even easily when the so easily related at a dose when it may justify be tricked it, as when a picture seems to have depth, though we also sometimes fail to perform it when we should, as when the starry sky seems to be a dome. Since apprehension of the first, second, and third dimensions of space is given by sensation, perception, and conception respectively, it seems plausible to suppose that apprehension of the fourth dimension of space would be given, if at all, by some fourth mental faculty added to the other three. We might hope to apprehend it through the emotional, non-conceptual, way of thinking found in art and in mystical religion. But in order to understand what this might mean, we turn to the analogy presented by the relation of our world to that of animals. Animals apprehend things, even three-dimensional things, as two-dimensional, yet surely animals must recognize the difference between a three-dimensional solid and a two-dimensional surface. They do recognize this difference, but not in the same way in which we recognize it. When walking around a house, both man and animal perceive a succession of different visual fields or facades. We, by our faculty of conception, integrate these into the three-dimensional object which includes them all. The animal, unable to do this, experiences nothing but the house as perceived, that is, as a two-dimensional object, but an object, constantly changing. For him it is an object changing or moving in time, whereas for us it is a fixed unchanging object, but infinitely greater and more complicated because three-dimensional. As the animal turns a corner of the house, its appearance, which for him is the whole house, changes more rapidly, that is, there is an acceleration. The change follows an orderly pattern analogous to what we call physical law, and presumably the animal anticipates the future appearance of the house if he is familiar with it or similar objects. In the case of an actually moving object, however, the change in appearance is brought about by the combination of two independent causes, the observer's motion and the object's motion. The consequent behavior of the apparent object will be much more complicated and so not follow any predictable pattern, and such an object must appear to the animal as transcending the laws of the physical world, that is, as being what we would call living. The dog barks at the passing automobile because to him it is alive. On the basis of these considerations we can understand how various kinds of objects must appear to various kinds of minds. A one-dimensional object, that is, a line, appears to a lower animal, for example, a snail, as a thing occupying part of the world. Lacking the faculty of perception, he cannot grasp simultaneously the line itself and the space on either side of it, and so cannot see how it fails to be substantial. A higher animal, for example, a dog, perceives the field in which the line exists. To him the line appears to be not a thing but the boundary or cross-section of a thing. To a man it appears even less substantial, being only a cross-section of a thing. A two-dimensional object cannot be grasped as a whole by the lower animal. Apprehending only part of it by sensation and not integrating his remembered sensations into any perceptual pattern, he considers the part he no longer senses to be past, the part he senses now to be present, and the part he has not yet sensed to be future. That is, to him the object appears to be changing or moving in time. To the higher animal it appears an unchanging thing, because it occupies a definite part of the infinite field of vision which for him constitutes the world. To a man it is only a surface or cross-section of a thing. A three-dimensional object, such as a house, is so far beyond the comprehension of the lower animal that it can only appear to him as changing or moving in an unpredictably complicated way analogous to the way in which the behavior of living organisms appears to us. Of course the snail does not think of it in these terms, since he does not think at all, but only senses. This object appears to the higher animal, who cannot integrate his remembered and anticipated perceptions of it into a single concept, as changing or moving, but in a less complex way. To a human being it is a stationary thing occupying a definite part of the three-dimensional universe. If there is a higher consciousness capable of apprehending the world in 4 dimensions, the three-dimensional object must appear to him not as a thing but as the boundary or cross-section of a thing. A 4-dimensional object, such as a moving automobile, which can be located only by 4 coordinates, appears even as to the it appears higher as animal. A 3 as unpredictable dimensional body, alive moving, as in it were time. With to a motion comprehensible in terms of past, present, and future. To the higher consciousness apprehending our past, present, and future all together, it would be a motionless body occupying a definite part of the 4-dimensional world. A 5-dimensional object, and Ouspensky suggests that such may be the bodies of living organisms, must appear to the higher animals an even more unpredictable and inscrutable appears to dimensional as a 3-object, dimensional, miraculous body moving, as it in time were but to moving as it in a way which eludes our understanding and scientific laws, a way which we call life and describe as freedom. Even to the higher consciousness it appears as moving in time. Hence Ouspensky's definition of life as motion in the 4th dimension, just as mechanical motion intelligible motion in only the in third terms dimension of a 5th is dimension intelligible, only in terms of the 4th dimension which we call time. If the 4th dimension is time, the 5th dimension is eternity, and if we are brought into the presence of time by the phenomena of mechanical motion, we are brought into the presence of eternity by the phenomena of life and death. An analysis of these considerations shows that space always increases at the expense of time, so that the mind which is more aware of space is correspondingly less aware of time. The dog, by his power of perception, has a greater space sense than the snail. Man, by his power of conception, has a still greater space sense, adding a 3rd dimension. The higher consciousness has a still greater space sense, apprehending our phenomenal world of the present moment as a mere section of his world. But where he sees unchanging and motionless things, we see change and motion in time. Where we see things, the animal sees change and motion in time. Where the animal sees things, the lower animal sees change and motion in time. And where each form of mind sees mechanical motion, the next lower form sees freedom and life. The less developed the consciousness, the more dynamic the world, the more developed the consciousness, the more static is the world. Time and space, therefore, are functions of our way of thinking, but they are by no means coordinate and equally subjective forms of intuition, as Kant suggested. Reality is spatial, that is, it consists of entities having a certain order among themselves. We cannot impose on reality a non-existent order. But, Being limited in our power of apprehension, we grasp only part of its objective order, and therefore impose on reality, so to speak, a non-existent lack of order. The space sense, defined as the power of representation by means of form, is, for any consciousness, the measure of its ability to apprehend the real world. This ability varies with the mental faculties available. The higher animal, adding to sensation the power of perception, apprehends the world more fully than the lower animal, man, with his concepts, still more fully, and the superhuman consciousness, with its additional faculty if such there be, even more fully. To apprehend the world more fully means to apprehend more space, since space is the form of the world. It means to apprehend another dimension, by which space is multiplied infinitely. Time is the vague apprehension of that which we cannot represent adequately. Whatever one is unable to integrate into his mental picture of the worlds is left over as vague and not actually existing past experiences he anticipates he remembers as the as not the yet no existing future. Whatever he can integrate finds its place in the actually existing present. Much that we humans can integrate, for example, the other side of the house, is for the animal past or future, not existing now. Much that we cannot integrate, for example, yesterday's sunset or tomorrow's sunrise, is for the higher consciousness existing now. If space is the measure of our apprehension of reality, time is the measure of our lack of apprehension. The higher the consciousness, the richer its space sense, and the lower the consciousness, the richer its time sense, but richness of time sense is only a pseudo-richness, because time is the measure not of knowledge but of ignorance. The idea of time recedes with the expansion of consciousness. Understanding the relation between time and space, and following the analogy of the relation between the animal's world and our own, we are prepared to consider the nature of the reality underlying our phenomenal world, the reality, that is, as it would appear, and perhaps does appear, to a consciousness higher than ours. What we call time he will call the fourth dimension of space. What we call motion he will call extension in the fourth dimension. What we call acceleration he will call an angle. What we call life he will call motion. And what we call space he will call a surface. What we call ether waves he will call surface waves. What we call the universe, he will call a cross-section of the universe, and not necessarily a particularly important one. What we call non-being he will recognize as those entities which do not happen to intersect our four-dimensional space-time at all. It is hard for us to realize that past and future events are for the experience of the higher consciousness, and also objectively in themselves, just as real as present events. It is harder for us to realize that other entities which are neither past nor present nor future, and so for us not existent at all, are equally real. And it is hardest for us to realize that past and future can be interchanged. For a consciousness confined to a plane, the variously colored spokes of a wheel rotating through that plane appear as a line of changing color, the spokes which have gone through being past and those which have not yet come being future, although in reality all the spokes are existing simultaneously. If two such wheels rotate in opposite directions, a spoke of one which is past and a spoke of the other which is future may really, that is, in the third dimension, be quite close to each other. Likewise, events we call past and events we call future may really, in the fourth dimension, be close together and capable of influencing each other without the intercession of any present event. These geometrical relations are only one aspect of the difference between the various ways of apprehending the world. The world as apprehended in the higher way differs from the world as apprehended in the lower way not only in being infinitely greater, because of its additional dimension of space, but also in possessing infinitely richer values incomprehensible to the lower consciousness. Just as an animal cannot comprehend the significance which a small inconspicuous object like a book may have for us, so we cannot comprehend the meanings, purposes, beauties, and values which an object we find insignificant may have for the higher consciousness apprehending it in ways transcending ours. Conversely, values we consider very important may appear in the higher perspective as having little or no significance, either theoretical or practical, like the shadows in Plato's cave. Furthermore, what we see as properties of a single object may be distinct and unrelated things intersecting only accidentally in our space, while what we see as distinct objects may be closely related parts of a single real thing. We are not, however, absolutely cut off from all knowledge of the higher world. We have at least two ways of approaching it: religion and art. In the teachings of the religious mystics we can recognize the characteristics we would expect to find in a description of the world as experienced in a higher way, a four-dimensionality implicit in their emphasis on eternity, with a corresponding depreciation of time, ineffable bliss and beauty, with a corresponding contempt for conventional values, thought primarily emotional, with a corresponding disparagement of rational criteria. The notorious irrationality of mystical literature is indeed inevitable, as we can see by considering the difficulty we would have in describing our conceptual experience in a language devised for perceptual experience and so having only proper nouns. For example, John and Peter are both men, would have to be expressed, John and Peter are both Johns and Peters. But art is our most powerful instrument of higher knowledge. In the fine arts we possess a technique by which conceptually indefinable beauties and meanings are intuited emotionally, though only by those who are capable of such intuition. Art, which apprehends profound differences among things physically alike, is the primitive beginning of the language of the higher world. We cannot consider this higher world logically, for our logic, as Kant correctly pointed out, applies only to our phenomenal world. Presented with the claim of a higher knowledge, we can either reject it or accept it on faith. But the practical response is to strive to make it real for us also, by developing our own latent mental powers. Ouspensky does not believe, with Kant, that we are forever confined to our present forms of intuition and categories of understanding, or, with Buck, that the human race is evolving toward cosmic consciousness. He believes that such evolution is possible, not for all men, being but for the some sign of, have potentially ability to superhuman create, not merely minority destroy. It is possible to wake up from a dream, especially if you realize that it is a dream, not however by means of anything you can do in the dream itself. Likewise, it is possible, for those innately capable, to awaken, as it were, from the phenomenal world. The first prerequisite is to realize that it is a phenomenal world, and therein lies the importance of epistemology. The means is not by doing anything in the phenomenal world itself, but by developing the emotional faculty latent in us, especially the unifying emotion of love. Space is the unity of reality. As the surface binds lines, and the solid binds surfaces, into a whole, so, four-dimensional space is the distance between a group of solids, separating these solids, yet at the same time binding them into some to us inconceivable whole. The faculties by which we know reality more adequately are unifying faculties. Just as perception correlates distinct sensations and conception integrates different perceptions, so love unites things which would otherwise be separate. This explains the importance of love in mystical experience. The mystic's goal is to become, by means of love, a superhuman mind, and so to apprehend the infinite richness of the four-dimensional reality. This goal is formulated, in a curiously literal way, in St. Paul's verse Ephesians 3:18, that ye, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all saints what is the breadth, and length, and depth, and height. Love, religion, and art, although often diverted to this worldly or even immoral ends, have as their purpose the enlargement of consciousness and consequent knowledge of that infinite reality of which the world we see is only an appearance. Criticism 1. The statement that a consciousness endowed only with sensation apprehends the world in one dimension seems to be an error. Sensation alone gives no dimensions at all, but only a stream of sense data. This stream forms, to be sure, a one-dimensional sequence, but this sequence is time, not space. The two dimensions of perceived space are produced together by the faculty of perception. Sensations, perceptions, and concepts produce phenomenal worlds not of 1, 2, and 3, but of 0, 2, and 3 dimensions respectively. 2. No reason is given why perception should reveal 2, rather than any other number of dimensions. Yet there seems to be a reason. We perceive the world in 2 dimensions, I suppose, because our sense organs are 2-dimensional. An exception is the organ of hearing, in which the sense receptors are arranged in a one-dimensional structure, and sounds consequently form a one-dimensional sequence of tones. In the retina, however, the receptors are arranged in a 2-dimensional structure, and the experience corresponding to their stimulation is a 2-dimensional field of vision, the points of which correspond to the visual receptors. If these receptors were arranged 3-dimensionally, if the retina were a semi-transparent jelly in which they were scattered, with some kinds of light able to penetrate more deeply than others and so stimulate the receptors farther from the surface, then the pattern of stimulation would be 3-dimensional, and presumably the corresponding experience likewise, and we would directly perceive solids instead of surfaces. Our touch receptors are also arranged in a 2-dimensional pattern on the skin, and retina and skin are the organs by which we perceive the world in 2 dimensions. Some fishes have the receptors of their principal sense organ arranged on a line, and presumably they, if they have the faculty of perception, experience the world as one-dimensional. 3. Ouspensky says that the 3rd dimension of space is known by conception, whereas the textbooks of psychology speak of our perception of the 3rd dimension. The fact seems to be that we have 3 words, sensation/perception/ and concept, to indicate 4 things: the simple data of immediate awareness, the patterns in which these data present themselves, the corporeal objects we construct by integrating these patterns with other remembered or imagined patterns, and the universal ideas we form by abstraction from such objects. Ouspensky uses the word sensation for the first, perception for the second, and concept for the third and fourth, while the textbooks use sensation for the first, perception for the second and third, and concept for the fourth. If we want 4 words for the 4 things, we might call the simple unarranged data sensations, their patterns not mixed with images; perceptions, corporeal objects, concrete concepts; and universals, abstract concepts. A difficulty in Ouspensky's doctrine appears immediately. His argument that animals lack concepts applies to abstract concepts, but his argument that concepts are necessary for the 3rd dimension applies to concrete concepts, and so the proof that animals inhabit a world of 2 dimensions collapses. This does not invalidate the general theory, but shows that the line between the 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional worlds need not necessarily be drawn at the point between non-human and human. 4. A more serious difficulty is involved in Ouspensky's attempt to abolish time from reality. An unmoving house may appear moving to the perceiving animal, but only if the animal himself is really moving. Ouspensky quotes with approval Tertium Organum, p. 130, Umhoff's statement, "Time does not flow, any more than space flows. It is we who are flowing, wanderers in a 4-dimensional universe." But does not this flowing of ours itself require a real time? Near the beginning of Tertium Organum p. 47, Ouspensky, after pointing out that we see the world as through a narrow slit, that is, we see only a cross-section of the 4-dimensional reality, asks 2 questions: why do we not see, through this slit, the same thing? And why can we not extend that slit? The rest of the book is an answer to the second question. We cannot extend the slit, because we are restricted by our characteristically human mental processes. We can extend it only if we change these. But no answer is ever given to the first question. To Ouspensky, though no more than to Plato, Kant, or any other philosopher who denies the reality of time, we cannot but pose the problem: how can there be even an illusion of time if the conscious subject is not changing, and how can the conscious subject change except in real time? Modern epistemology began with Descartes' distinction between mind and matter, that is, subjective self and objective world. This distinction led to Hume's skepticism. Since mind knows matter neither innately, as Locke had shown, nor empirically, as Berkeley had shown, we can have no knowledge of the objective world. Science is impossible, because scientific knowledge is knowledge of the laws governing the external object, and the subject, confined to its own experience, has no means of discovering the laws of that which is outside its experience. Kant refuted Hume's conclusion by showing that, although Hume's argument was sound, he was wrong in concluding that it invalidated scientific knowledge. Hume did not understand what science is. We must go beyond the distinction of subject and object and subdivide the object into reality and appearance. With regard to the reality, or thing in itself, Hume's argument is valid, and no knowledge is possible. But with regard to the appearance, or phenomenon, knowledge is possible, because its laws are synthetic judgments a priori determined by the subject. Science is possible because it is concerned with the objective world, to be sure, but with its appearance, not its reality. But in demonstrating the possibility of science, Kant at the same time demonstrated the impossibility of mysticism. Mysticism is an alleged knowledge of reality, and reality is just what Kant showed to be unknowable. If the mystics have forms of intuition and categories of understanding different from those of other people, then no doubt the world must appear to them differently, but this peculiar world of the mystics is only a different appearance, a different phenomenal world, and could at best claim only an equal validity with the ordinary phenomenal world. Mysticism, therefore, defined as knowledge of reality, seems to be impossible, just as science, defined as knowledge of the external object, seemed to be impossible before Kant's explanation of it. Ouspensky demonstrates the possibility of mysticism in a manner similar to that in which Kant demonstrated the possibility of science, and so is related to Kant somewhat as Kant was related to Hume. The world as it appears to the mystics, different from the world as it appears to other men because apprehended emotionally instead of conceptually, is not just another phenomenal world, but is the reality of which the ordinary phenomenal world is an appearance. Just as, in order to understand the possibility of science, we must divide the object into reality and appearance, so, in order to understand the possibility of mysticism, we must subdivide the reality into ultimate reality and proximate reality. Ultimate reality, the thing in itself, is unknowable, as Hume, Kant, and Ouspensky all agree. But the proximate reality, that is, the reality of which a given appearance is the appearance, may be knowable, though not by the same means by which the appearance is known. Although the proximate reality is itself only an appearance of the ultimate reality, still it is reality relative to its own appearances. A house, for example, even though a mere phenomenon, is the reality of which one of its own facades or cross-sections is an appearance, less real than the house itself. Likewise, a four-dimensional entity is the reality of which one of its three-dimensional sections is an appearance. To know the reality, rather than the appearance, in this sense of proximate reality, is to have knowledge infinitely greater in spatial content, in values, and in significance. If the mystic does have such knowledge, he can rightly claim to have knowledge of reality rather than appearance. Thus Ouspensky's analysis of the relation among ways in which the same object may appear to different minds gives a meaning to the claim that the mystic's experience is an experience of reality and so establishes the possibility of mysticism. It does not demonstrate its actuality. Kant's distinction between thing in itself and phenomenon establishes the possibility of science. But actual science requires the existence of human minds with human categories of understanding. Ouspensky's distinction of the degrees of reality establishes the possibility of mysticism. But actual mysticism requires the existence of saints endowed with some additional faculty. The evidence for the existence of such mystical experience is well known. Ouspensky's collection of citations from mystical literature is the least original part of his work. Readers already convinced of the actuality of mysticism may not need this defense of it. But those who, while unable to ignore the evidence for the existence of mystical experience, are equally unable to understand in what sense such experience can validly claim a value or reality beyond that of ordinary experience, will find in Ouspensky's doctrine a hypothesis by which this claim can be defended. Ouspensky believes that knowledge is apprehension of space because space is the synthesis of reality and knowledge is the synthesis of our experience of reality. Sensation gives us the content of experience. Perception, conception, and love are unifying faculties which enable us to integrate that content more and more fully, and so synthesize it more and more fully in a spatial structure corresponding to that of objective reality. Time is our failure to synthesize experience and therefore our failure to apprehend reality. In thus identifying space with reality and time with illusion, Ouspensky is carrying on the Platonic tradition of exalting being over becoming, and so stands in the 20th century as a champion of classical philosophy against one of its most vigorous opponents, the most distinguished of his contemporary philosophers, Bergson. For Kant, space and time are equally subjective and, in a sense, unreal. Both Ouspensky and Bergson reject this coordination, but in opposite ways. For Bergson, time is reality, while space is an artificial creation or illusion due to our conceptualization of reality. For Ouspensky, space is the reality, and time is the illusion resulting from our inadequate comprehension of space. For Ouspensky, only being is real, for Bergson only becoming. Formulated in these terms, the two philosophies seem sharply opposed. But the space which Bergson rejects as unreal is conceptual space, while the space which Ouspensky recognizes as real is a four-dimensional space transcending concepts. He too believes that we come to an apprehension of reality through an intuition of time, but he believes that such intuition leads to the absorption of time into space. Bergson will not consider the world subspecie eternitatis lest time's creativity be lost. Ouspensky believes that such consideration does not destroy time's creativity but only its subjective vagueness. For Ouspensky, no less than for Bergson, reality eludes our scientific frames of thought. Space and time are contrasted only in the phenomenal world, becoming indistinguishable in the world of four dimensions. From this point of view, the philosophy of the fourth dimension might be considered a synthesis of the Platonic philosophy of being and its antithetical Bergsonian philosophy of becoming. Ouspensky, however, is not so introspective as Bergson. We look within ourselves to study the principles of psychology and epistemology, but we do not look within ourselves to discover truth. For that we look without which reveals truth inadequately yet accurately, first by sensation far as it goes, then by perception, then by discursive concepts, then by love. We grow in wisdom not by denying experience but by enlarging it. Love frees us from the limitations of ordinary human thinking, and this freedom gives us a fuller knowledge of the truth. A fuller, but never a final, knowledge, the true and real progress of thought, he says at the end of Tertium Organum, is only in the broadest striving toward knowledge, that does not recognize the possibility of arrestment in any found forms of knowledge at all. The meaning of life is in eternal search. Herein Ouspensky differs from such a mystical philosopher as Plotinus. He explains the possibility of mysticism as knowledge of the proximate reality, and he suggests the ineffable bliss and richness of such knowledge. But beyond the fourth dimension is the fifth. Reality is knowable, but only because ultimate reality is unknowable.